And people are still coming in, but I'm going to get started because I don't want to take a moment away from our poets that have joined us today. So it's so good to see everybody here, first-time visitors as well as our regulars, some of you on the Poets Corner. For those who don't know, the Poets Corner was founded in June of 2020 by myself and my good friend, Catherine Seitz, whose wonderful energy helped us launch this thing, whatever you call it, on Zoom, and who, because of her health, is no longer able to be a part of it. But the two of us were sheltered in, and we wanted to create community for ourselves and among other writers and readers of poetry and short prose. So we decided to host this Zoom platform and a monthly reading, which we've been doing for now over 3 years. And we now have more than 3,000 members of that community from all over the world. And it's so wonderful to see. We still do monthly readings, usually on the second Sunday of every month. Sometimes we've changed it a little bit. This year, we introduced a few craft talks. And we also have a biannual chapbook competition. So that will be in 2024. And Marie Howe will be the judge for our competition in 2024. Just giving you a little heads up. We haven't put that out there yet. But a couple of things that we do have coming up. We have an annual collaboration with the Page Gallery here in Camden, Maine, where they host an exhibition of art in their gallery, and it's online, and we invite poets to submit ekphrastic poems to any of the works of art that are in the exhibition. There's paintings, photography, sometimes sculpture. And so the gallery show will be online beginning October 12th. We'll send out a notification about how to submit your poems this week. We'll choose about 10 poets to read in November on the Poets Corner on November 12th on a Sunday. And then the artists themselves will choose another 10 poets and to have their poems read in the gallery. And if they're local, then they want able to read them themselves. They'll be invited to read. And if not, somebody else will read their poem. But it's really fun to have the artists also selecting the poets. So more about that, details are on the website, thepoetscorner.org. And in December, the first Sunday of December, we'll return with our award-winning Rilke translator, Mark Burroughs, for his 3rd annual Rilke celebration. And joining Mark this year will be Padre Gotuma and Marie Howe. So that will be also a very special event. So for today's very exciting. And I'm going to be introducing 2 distinguished poets, Spencer Reece and Matt Daly, to read for us today. And I'm going to start with introducing Matt. But I got to know Matt a little bit, mostly online. This is my first time meeting him face to face through Spencer. So because Spencer said, I'm going to be in Wyoming, and why don't we invite Matt to read too? I'm a wonderful poet in Wyoming. So they are both in the same room in Wyoming and going to be reading today. Matt is the only true Westerner here, I think, or reading. I think there are a lot of Westerners online. And that is so evident. I've been reading his book, Between Here and Home, and he's been sharing some poems with me lately, and you get such a sense of people and place, and a sense of Matt being of the place that he's from. He's the author of the collection I just showed you, Between Here and Home, and has a second collection coming out in 2024 called The Invisible World. He's the recipient of a I don't know how you pronounce this, Nelson Blanchard. Is that right?
Yeah, Nelchi Blanchard.
Nelchi Blanchard award for writing inspired by the natural world. And I can see that, in his writing, that inspiration that comes through in the beautiful imagery and descriptions. He's also received a creative writing fellowship in poetry from the Wyoming Arts Council. He's the co-founder of Right to Thrive, an enterprise that brings reflective and creative writing practices to individuals and professional groups to cultivate creativity and well-being. He's certainly a poet that has a real gift for language, form, and bringing us into the natural world. So please join me in welcoming Matt Daly.
Meg, thank you so much. And thanks everybody for being here. I recognize a few folks, and it's just marvelous to be present and here with Spencer, with the snowshoes in the background and a little snow on the mountains here in Wyoming. I thought I would get us started with a Western theme from a poem from a chapbook I published called Red State. That's a lot of Wyoming poems. This one is titled Not a Praise Poem to the West. Not to the West, when the West was an ocean, not to the promise of the city on a hill, not to the call when the West was Kentucky, not to the purchase or the love of a bargain, not to ownership or the idea of ownership, not to the railroads or the spike that joined them, not to the bison bones carted away. Not to the West when the West was a terminus, not to California and its fault-furrowed hills, not to the dust or the nuggets in streams, not to the men who panned for the dust or the men who dug for the nuggets, not to the men who melted the ore or who forged the spike or who pounded the spike, that staple that stitched the oceans together. Not to the men who wound their watches while the air filled with coal smoke and steam. Not to golden pocket watches or their taut golden chains, not to the idea of the West, that ideal which is a great plow that scrapes the great land to dust as the great plow spins in an idle circle overhead, invisible in the golden light wash of all the cities sprung up where hills used to be. I thought I'd read one more from Red State, the title poem. And there's reference to one of my favorite, I think, of Western poets, Jim Harrison, in this poem. Red State. Still, I can't keep myself away from the river or the bears. I never met Harrison, but I use his name as a blue boat oared across a lake hardly worth mentioning that I've never seen. Out here, the wind is subject and verb. No storm surge or reports from a full mouth, a full glass. Sometimes I just stare into the river, the cuff of my denim work shirt still dark from where a trout took my hand and led me underwater. Sometimes I just watch a school of whitefish murmur. In my childhood dreams, there are never starlings. The birds keep replacing one another in an irrigated field. I want to go to the bar, but I hold myself back, saying it's for the kid. I wonder what kind of career move it is to wish the dog would get skunked. And then a few nights later, to pull him up on the couch where we can fall asleep to reruns of suburban violence. I keep living where I'll never get ahead because of the bear tracks plodding right past the plastic grocery bag, billowing like an old man's hair underneath one of the origins of the Pacific. So I'm kind of moving from book to book. I thought I'd read just a couple poems from Between Here and Home, the book that Meg mentioned. It's lovely to be able to read from this. This was published in the summer of 2019, and so chances to read diminished soon after. So it's nice to be able to read a few poems from this collection. The collection is a series of persona poems that paint sort of a portrait of a small, sort of imagined Wyoming community. So these are two voices from that collection. The titles all have the speaker in the title. Skylar holds his mother's picture. I should leave what's left of it under that tree, Bev worries over. But then Bev will know I've carried it here in my pocket all this time. She might decide to carry it herself, but time's come to let go. Come morning, this will all be lost in the dawn east of me. Like the sun, I'll keep on to the west, watching all the green and the rivers grow. Where the waters join in darkness, I'll fold up what's left of my only picture of my mother, Roberta. It won't be a song I sing when I place her in the obsidian ocean, just the tide. It won't be the wind, but the fierce sounds of distant birds. The other poem I'd like to read from Between Here and Home is titled Pam Replants Her Garden. Pam's sort of the title character, the main character of the collection, who's had an accident, ends up paralyzed from the accident. And then as the community tries to support her, they discover an ultrasound photograph in her nightstand. So there's reference to some of that. And so there's a kind of a secret of hers, and the collection invites all of these community members to imagine the parts of their lives that are spoken and unspoken in this small community. Pam replants her garden. I insisted on paying Bev for the dirt she brought over. The unopened sack drooped over its own middle fold, reminded me of me now, chair me. I couldn't stand looking at that goddamn bag, slumped away from siding and my cinder block foundation, so I wheeled down the ramp to put the soil the bag held in the ground. I put in Columbine for Russ, or for what he is now, a man in the grave. I'll give them to Bev when they bloom to put with him, to pay him what I can for this ramp he's hammered together, a gift he left here for me. For Bev, a few sunflowers to cut before they sag, big and full of seeds, something for her to take to Birdie where she tends her. I mixed that new dirt in with the old, thought of planting myself a wild rose, but I've been around long enough to know underground, they tangle every other root they touch. Their blossoms are pretty when they flash, but the rest of them gets in the way. I'll wait to plant anything for me, to see what can best stand the dry and cold and still show buds like little embers, glowing night or day, what bears the warmth that sends some bolting past the weight of themselves, their stems can carry. I'll leave an empty pot by where this ramp now covers where stairs used to be. And I thought I'd just read a section of one more poem. I have as Meg mentioned, this book coming out next fall, in just under a year, called The Invisible World. It has two really long poems, one at the opening and one at the end, which was kind of a fun experience to try to write a really long poem. I hadn't done that before. And so I just thought I'd read the last few sections of the final poem. It's right at the end of the book, really, called Plant Apparitions. Yes, I've boiled nettles in a camp pot to eat and call them sour, and compared them to this or that leaf picked up at the grocery store in the humdrum summer heat and tourist haze. Yes, I've leaned my leg into them to be stung, if only for the sake of feeling. I've carried chosen pains, and those stumbled through all day and let them welt and redden me. Yes, I have stood wincing in a stream beside festooning nettles. I've allowed myself to go all numb, my ancestor, beyond the simple pain of feeling what nourishes. I returned from searching for the next plot metered 10 by 10, where 2 years prior, fire deviled everything to pebbled dirt and black. My job to lead a group of students from square to count what new grew there, trees, forbs, grasses. Heat cicada buzzed me quiet, the group quiet, stalked between boy-high stems of fireweed, the bloom stalks like cairns covered in pink butterflies. My eyes unable to find anyone in the world tolling back into itself, rooted in black release of what it takes to root again. Clouds piled up, as they might have when the strike caught. No one spoke, and I could not find them. My steps crushed one or another plant. I parted greenly into the circle of young hands sticky with fireweed, reeked and feathered by wisps of seeds like words I could not speak, have not yet learned to speak, my ancestor, outside this voice I used to speak to you. Neither of us ever fought in a war that was not playing at war as boys before we met and became friends who never fought. The wars I played at were with boys I knew and usually included melting plastic army men or lighting the fuses of as many bottle rockets as we could tape or tie to try to launch the men we had not melted into the street. The wars you played at were not anything we talked about. The river called, and sometimes we answered together, like the time before my marriage ended in a peaceful accord, when a storm sprung up no more quickly than any other August afternoon, but quick enough and with enough charge crackling through it that we had to hustle from the side channel toward the car. You never liked lightning or thunder. You never liked to show how scared you were of air. So we fled into the cottonwood grove, dappled with already fallen leaves and sunlight and elk bones. We hustled and lowered our rods and watched the hairs on our arms for the terror of standing. And just like that, the trees show curtained onto a river channel facing the stormlit peaks I have lived near for years and just then did not know. The same channel we had left minutes before. We were together, my ancestor, when inattention to the line between place and thought in fear of a bolt were a circle we looped before any rain. I was with you once when you killed an elk, and once when we tracked one wounded through a long, cold day. Apart when you watched a man breathe in the river, and when I kindled my partnered life to ash before replanting. You've lost more people you love than I have lost, my ancestor. And someday I will die, and you will stand and turn under leaf light, under bark scars, and there will be a war someplace we will not visit, and I hope my son will not be there. I wonder, my ancestor, will you remark on how the river channels are dry where they used to be? This time, the extinction event is a profusion of black bear shit slurry worrying the trail, fingerling branches bow with berry weight before teeth and lips strip them nearly bare. If I'm not taking off my clothes in the woods, then I'm thinking about disrobing and the bright pricks of frost or sunlight honing me. Off trail, the rivulet loudens, and the maze of things presents itself as shadows beyond each selection. I'm one of those people who was told, turn right, turn right, turn right. I have heard that fruit sweetens after a hard frost. My body, as do bodies, stiffens and softens. The crush of seed flesh in my mouth bitters me inside as if dust. I have fallen face first into claw marks on the coated skin of aspens, broken branch scars. Scars eye me or flit away like waxwings. Some birds become so much fermented fruit, they lose the will to flight. Some bears reach past shambled wasp nests and tug the fine branches mouthward. I have been talking with my bare tongue about the speechless places. I have felt their tang fall like a spider thread into my belly. Some cubs let the profusion of fine twigs hold them until all the fruits are pits. Snow will clamp down, and after that, sprouts. I keep telling this story, and yet I cannot identify the species of needled tree I prepared to live my life under. You are, by now, familiar with the details. Child, birthday, trail, 2 lakes, excitement into a dash up the wrong trail, tall grass, red needles, evening, solitude. I do not remember loving or even reading stories of boys lost in wild places or raised by wild mothers. Instead, I liked the one about the boy who flew an airplane made of bread dough. I never cared where he landed. I know that I felt whether or not this really happened, as if I could become this ragged life raised by a conifer I still cannot name, raised on a green slope punctuated by forbs under branch shadows and comforted by the red needled duff and cones. I sense now, with that sense underneath my senses, how some new self birthed itself that day, how quiet I could be, and how you, my ancestor, with your unusual name, called out my plain name over the slope of plants just tall enough to hold me out of sight, and how my tongue spoke the language of bark instead of tumbling into your arms. Even that young, I knew what I would always be leaving. I have known other women and men, other forests with their many trees, and I have felt your ancient feeling, disappointment, and underneath my ancestor, the pulsing of sap. I will not stop giving myself bodily to the meadow. Stems of alpine timothy bend under me in their ancient way of offering to spring back up as soon as I go on. I have no memories of a mouth that did not sip from combs. One of these days, I'll be underground or sprinkled over a field in flower or a field of snow or planted with the roots of a little tree ready to embrace everything but the metal bits of me, mercury and screws. To be made again of sunlight, and the reaching of radicals is the oldest memory I've written into each place I've touched and every touching part of me. Oh, to reek of earth again, and to be unconcerned with patterns made of stars or words. Thanks.
Wow, Matt, that was just beautiful. And each one, each book is so different in style and form, and to hear you read from all 3 was just a real delight and treat. And I can't wait to have more conversation about it later. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
So now we're going to hear from Spencer Reece. And I'm excited because I met Spencer just about a year ago at a very dear friend's wedding, where Spencer, who is a poet, priest, and painter, did the blessing for the wedding. And he did this beautiful call and response that engaged every single guest that was there. And then he spoke about forgiveness as being an essential part of a long, happy marriage. And I haven't forgotten that. I don't always practice it well, but I haven't forgotten it. And he read this beautiful poem from a young poet from Honduras. So he is not from the West. He actually lives in Rhode Island right now, but has lived in Honduras and in Madrid, Spain. And so is just sort of a poet of the world, I guess you would say. His first book of poetry was The Clerk's Tale, and it was selected by Louise Gluck as the winner of the Breadloaf Conference Bakeless Prize, and also recognized with an award from the Library of Congress. So he kind of burst on the poetry scene at the age of 41, I think, after writing poetry most of his life, I believe. His second collection, The Road to Emmaus, was longlisted for National Book Award and a finalist for the Griffin Prize, the world's most prestigious poetry award. So his recent works include a memoir and a book of paintings published in 2021, The Secret Gospel of Mark, a poet's memoir, and All the Beauty Still Left, a poet's painted book of hours. And he also has a book coming out in 2024. And I think maybe he'll read a little bit from that as well. But I had the opportunity to have a conversation with Spencer at the reception. It was very brief, but just his presence just emanated, a warmth and a welcome. And I wanted to reach out to ask him, to invite him to read on the Poets Corner. And so glad that you're able to join us today. Thank you so much. And please join me in a very warm welcome for Spencer Reece.
All right. Whoops. Hold on, should we plug it in? Can everybody hear me? I'm used to asking that question at church. I just finished a wonderful service here at St. John's, and I see a few people on from the church, and it was great. Thank you, Meg, for inviting me and reminding me how we met. That was a lovely wedding. And just before coming here to Jackson Hole, Wyoming, which is in my mind so full of God that I think you could hear, particularly in that last poem, Matt, that was a beautiful poem. So Dr. Sue from our parish back in St. Paul's helps me with an author series, and we'll have to have Matt come immediately so that we can share his talent with our folks back in Rhode Island. Just before I got on the plane to come to Jackson Hole, after a very busy year as the vicar of Wickford, which everybody laughed at today because it makes me sound like a PBS miniseries, which I accept. I got the opportunity to do this wedding at St. Paul's in Wickford, and it was so powerful and full of love. And so I'm still sort of coasting on that feeling, and the beautiful things that can happen in a church world. I'm going to set the timer so I don't go over 15 minutes. And I'm going to just read you 5 poems from this new book that's coming out in May of hold on, I can't do this and talk at the same time. I got it. Okay. The book is called Acts, which is a book in the Bible, the Acts of the Apostles, which follows the Gospels, and that's the title of the book. And it's about acts of faith. The book begins with an epigraph from an artist that I greatly admire, Deanne Arbus. She's a photographer. She's an artist that I have turned to time and again over my career, along with David Hockney. They inspire me. And so this book begins with an epigraph that she wrote, which is, "The thing that is important to know is that you never know." And this first poem I'd like to read is called Sanctus, which is when you have a church service, it's right at the beginning, you have a Sanctus. And this poem is about connecting to what we just heard with Matt, a praise of the natural world and Wyoming, where God is just all over the place. This poem, the speaker is working with a bishop in Madrid, and the book is in some ways a homage to the love that you can find in church. Sanctus. a cathedral, and all the church that's being described in Madrid is extremely poor and extremely humble. And the poem is really little, tiny little 3-line stanzas. Sanctus, a cathedral without a bell, a mouth without a tongue, a pillaged pyramid in Madrid. Between services, the bishop, purple shirt, white ruffles, gold cope, chasuble, a mitre, lappets, a firefighter decorated with his rig. He sweats, he spins, the tin globe unoiled for years, screeching like a massacre, crisscrossed with lines charting Columbus. O Israel, help me arise, recount, recalibrate, save, dispatch, a story of tenderness. One of the themes of this book, if you're my age, just turned 60, which I mentioned today in the service, is that when I was young, we really did a lot of communicating through letters, handwritten letters, typewritten letters. Marie Howe, who just read for us in Rhode Island, recently also wrote a poem about this. And so I think if you're my age or a little older, you have noticed, you could not help but notice the complete disappearance of the letter and the intimacy that happened in that form that doesn't exist anymore. And so the Bible, the New Testament, is made up of these letters. And I'm going to read you one of these letters. The longer poem is called Letters from Spain. And this is the last of those letters where our speaker, after 10 years in Madrid, receives a call. His mother, they don't know if his mother's going to make it through the night, and he's called back to the United States. And this causes him to reflect, and he's on the plane. And I'll read this poem, also not very long. And there's some Spanish in it because I and the speaker were immersed in that culture and that language for many, many years. So the title of the poem is Mañana por la mañana, which is a Spanish expression which means a tomorrow after tomorrow. When you're asking to get something done in Spain, and if the person responds by saying mañana por la mañana, it means that it's probably not going to happen. Mañana por la mañana. Clouds advance in their armada. I'm headed home, wherever that might be. Home, what word warms the tongue more? In my tight seat, we fly towards JFK. George Herbert on my tray, the dog drugged under the seat in front of me, and church on Calle de la Beneficencia. You will go on and be late, 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 very late. Aloisi, flip the circuit breakers, click, click, click. Illumina la catedral. Bag the grub, fruits, tubers, spuds, the beet, its ruby religion. Cógelo y ven por acá. Light up the biblical saying on the wall. Sacrifica a Dios alabanza y paga tus votos al Altísimo. The heat will not work, no me digas. The metro will rumble, people will line up for their bags of food, some will pray, others will shout into cell phones waiting for handouts. 2 old ladies will sit and chit-chat about God. Go on, go on, go on. Will take years, but eventually a new cleric will arrive and replace me and hold out the money plate. Othlo, Othlo, And here's a tambourine, a pandereta while you're at it. And who knows, la puerta está abierta siempre es vencer. El obispo said, oh, Spanish slowness, generous, graceful, meticulous, kind. Thornton Wilder once said, it takes a year to get a letter from Spain. España, España, te quiero muchísimo. No encuentro las palabras para expresarlo. Predica, Aloisi, predica. Sing, Bishop, sing. Well, we're doing good. Got 7 minutes. The book is set up like an altar. I saw so many altars in Madrid in my time living there, working as the canon to the ordinary for the Bishop of Spain. In many ways, you know, sometimes in work can also be its own kind of marriage. And although he was happily married to his wife, in many ways, the bishop and I were married for a long time as we worked in our various efforts for the church there. And so the book is set up like an altar. It begins, Matt had a poem in the voice of another, and the poem opens with a poem in the voice of San Sebastian. It ends with a poem in the voice of Maria Magdalena. And in the middle, there's a poem that's in the voice of Humpty Dumpty, who I regard as a Christ figure. You know, that weird little bachelor egg in his bow tie falling off the wall. Ever since a kid, I don't know what you all think, but I was always like, what is this about? So I put this poem in the voice of Humpty Dumpty, and it's dedicated to a dear friend of mine, Mark Wunderlich, who's a poet. If you haven't read him yet, I hope you will. He's another expert on Rilke. So in the voice of Humpty Dumpty, again, it's like a really narrow poem. It looks like this. Can you see? These are the galleys for the book that's it's getting ready to be published. Humpty Dumpty. Iowa, in my owl eye, I crack. Delicate Acropolis, Io. Remember that cow from Greek mythology, the woman that gets turned into a cow, her name was Io. Delicate Acropolis, Io, fleeing Wisconsin, Fabergé, Easter, ego, egg, off the Empire State, I go, I wow, my hoi polloi, my yoke, my holy water, Puck in an ascot, a girly Houdini hemicorporectomy, a jazzy capote swirl. O Iago, I am the town of Santiago, a Stonewall disco ball, a poof of Ruth with Boaz, Christ's lollipop, an appomattox of polka dots. After the war, Picasso never went back to Spain. Spain made his heart a suitcase. Okay, I'm still pretty good. Okay, just 2 more left. Neither one that long. The book is also, I referenced marriages in the beginning, from Richard Blanco and his lovely partner, Mark, to this wedding of Carrie and Caroline that I just did. And the book, I am the product of parents who I love very much. My father's been dead now 1 year, and my mother's in a nursing home, and they were married for 60 years. And this poem is addressed to my mother. She's in a nursing home in Old Saybrook, Connecticut, which is called Glade View. And the poem is called Glade View Jeu. Jeu is a French word which means a game. So Glade View game or Glade View Jeu. Once four, now three. I have a brother. So once there was four of us, and now there's three of us, right? Once four, now three. We, her retinue. Queen of Hearts, where is your bow? Pretty once with an opal brooch. Connecticut, have you seen her bow? Oh, Ophelia, how's your tummy? London Bridge falling down. Baby mama, our aide from Ghana, have you seen his boutonniere? Loretta, prettiest name I know. We're private, Spencer, private as Hepburn at Fenwick. Close the door. The window, an ambulance of autumn, we can't open in our hibernaculum. That's a fun word, hibernaculum. That's like a scientific place where they can watch bears hibernate. The window, an ambulance of autumn, we can't open in our hibernaculum. Orange October, gaga with gutters and chrysanthemums. Endymion, our old moon wants red boots. Where are her red boots? Will it snow? Social worker, where will she go? Once four, now three, a small run, gin rummy. I'm out. Oh, Queen of Hearts, Queen of Hearts, Queen of Hearts, Queen of Hearts, where is your bow? Thank you for listening. The last poem, right before the timer goes off. This is perfect. I got 1 minute to go. I'll turn off. This last poem is, I always wanted to write a really, really short poem. So this poem's only 2 lines long, and it's called Nunc Dimittis. And that, you know, in a church service is when you sing for the dead. And oh gosh. So in my life in Rhode Island, as people know that work or worship with me there on Monday, I go to see my mom. And so this is for my mom. So yeah, in this altar, you know, the book is like an altar with sort of Jesus, Humpty Dumpty in the middle, Maria Magdalena, and San Sebastian. There's these letter poems, and then there's this leitmotif of people that were married a very long time, and the only now at 60 do I realize, well, what a privilege it was to be a witness to this huge marriage, not something I've known in my own life, but something that I have seen and wanted to honor. Nunc Dimittis, a mother's universe is love in reverse. Thank you for listening.
Wow. That was amazing.
Right on time, Meg.
Yes, and that was so amazing. Not only the timing, but the poetry, yes. And Humpty Dumpty and Jesus in one, you know, that was unexpected. And we have another unexpected person, I think, that is going to join us for this conversation part. Let me see if I can find him in the, let's see if I can spotlight him. Let's add another spotlight here for a special guest.
A surprise. Beautiful work, you two. Wow, amazing. What a great way to spend the afternoon.
If there's
So-
anybody who doesn't know who this is, RB is Richard Blanco.
Yeah, I was trying to be sneaky there. Uh,
So thank you, Richard, for joining us. Wasn't that wonderful?
yeah,
Hearing Spencer.
great to
read.
hear the new works, Spencer.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you both
really
have
good.
books coming out in 2024. So what's it like, this period of time when you finish the writing, but before the book comes out? Is it a productive time, creative time, fallow time?
Yeah, I mean, for me, what's really fun is the books tend to be I start to think of them as a project, and like are all the parts working together? And now I'm just making poems and not worried about that, so it actually is a really kind of lively time in a way, because so I'm just making, and where things go is where they go, and I'll worry about them later, so that I love this time.
What about you, Spencer?
I felt really just empty, and I'm dealing with the grief of my father still. And so when I'm not busy at work, or and now there's nothing more to do because it's totally done, and I've spent 11 years on it, and it's hard. It's a challenge for me to write again. I don't have anything in me, and then I'm sort of afraid, like, well, maybe that's it. Like maybe and then in that moment, I'm just my father is really coming forward. So I guess that's where I am emotionally with it
Yeah.
all. But I mean, it's exciting. It's such a gift to be able, as everybody on here knows, to be able to write, and then on top of it, to be able to have a book in the world is, it's a great gift, and I never really lose sight of what a gift it is to be bound.
Well, Richard, you're in a different phase of that with your book just coming out and launch. Is your launch in October or November?
Yeah, in Portland, and on the 27th, and it's out the 24th. I'm sort of in a Spencer camp a little bit. It's kind of like the empty nest syndrome, and also like, thank God the kid went away to college. I'm done with this thing. Like, get it out of my hands. Like, I mean, I have the box of books there. I haven't even opened it. I'm just like, I'm done. Like, yeah. But I also, every time I write, I empty everything I have, and it's interesting, Matt, probably like you, like some writers continue writing, right? Like my professor Campbell McGrath was working on always like on 3 or 4 books at a time, but I always when I finish a book, I've dumped everything. Like there's no unpublished work after that, and so I just start collecting again, and I'll have to take a hiatus from writing, and then it comes the worst part of, I think, for all of us, right? Is that the whole publicity thing, like buy my book thing, which is just like the author questionnaire and all that stuff. I'm just like, ugh, like this is not. I didn't sign. Wasn't part of my job description as poet.
It wasn't, huh? That's not
But
what
we
you
have to do it
dreamed
because
of.
we have to do it, and I just feel it's also part of one's professional duty, right? Like, it's hard because we're the artists, but you want people, if the poem can do some good work in the world for someone else's life, it's worth swallowing your your yourself for a little bit.
Wonder about, the process of sharing the work, though, is an important part of putting those poems out into the world, isn't it? And seeing that, it's hard to see on Zoom, but seeing that response to your work in a reading or whatever, is that important to you, or is it more important just the writing and putting it together?
Um, I find that really important, in a way. Like I sort of set the work, the poems aside, and I don't really think about them very much unless I'm um, sharing them. I feel like, well, years ago, Robert Pinsky came here to read, and he said in one of his talks, the meaning of a poem happens in the ear of the person who hears it. And I just have never forgotten that, that it feels like that something about the poem feels like it's really a poem when that's happening. And that it's a little bit imaginary otherwise or something, like so that continues to feel really, really like an essential part to me, maybe the essential part.
So the question is, how important is sharing our work?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's everything. God has given us this gift, and the gift, if we don't share it, then what, the thing is to be shared. And I really didn't understand that because I kind of had this twisted Yankee self-effacement, not wanting to, like erase myself. But that's kind of not helpful in the world. And when I got to Honduras and Nuestras Pequeñas Rosas and the orphanage there, and I began to share poetry with them and see it transform them, I got a whole new understanding. So that was super powerful, that the poetry could change those girls' lives, that it could be a vehicle for freedom, for self-esteem, and it was something that was theirs. I never saw poetry so powerful, because usually it's just considered, worthless. It doesn't, it detaches itself from money as soon as you write it. But it can also be, the flip side of it is that it can be the super powerful engine of identity and so many things. And on a personal level, just the other night, Dr. Sue and another church member, Andrew, was there, I think, and we had a meal together, and I felt comfortable enough to just share something new. And that's also very meaningful when you find people you can trust. And maybe it's not very good, but just to have, you need those people, because most of it you're alone. So
yeah, I hear that. I mean, that's why I created the Poets Corner. But at the same time, I was with a group of poets that took a class with Richard that have been meeting every month for the last 3.5 years. There's 9 of us. And I had that experience yesterday that Matt talked about, of sharing a poem that was recent work that I had just written, and hearing people see so much more in it that I didn't even realize was there. So it sort of came alive for me and gave me an opportunity to think about how I wanted to shape it further in that case. But for you, Richard, what's the role of sharing your work?
Matt, you wanted to add something?
Oh, just quickly, I think, because I've had a chance to hear a couple of these poems of Spencer's a couple of times, and I just think like part of it is being the listener too, and like, oh, that's possible. Oh, that's possible. I mean, that's my experience as a listener of poems, is sort of, it's like the possibility in the world opens, so to be part of that feels like extraordinarily special to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think I wholeheartedly agree with what you're both saying. I think we're all circling around the same sense of, I always consider the last phase almost like a butterfly, like, turns into a butterfly when that poem happens in someone's ear, like you said, Matt, or happens live. And I think that comes from the very nature of poetry as oral tradition, right? At the campfire, its DNA, it just doesn't get away from that. But I will add that also, the poems, as I read them live, and it has to be live and it has to be an audience, keep on teaching me what they're about, because I'm like, oh, like I'm starting to read new poems. I'm like, oh, that's what that meant. And I start reading them differently. And I start also improvising more, because I was like, damn, I should have put that word in there. But you can't do that at your desk. It has to be with live, with people, with sentient beings around you. And then when they share their stories of how the poems live in them, it teaches you also, so the poems keep on teaching who they want to be in the world, even after they're in print.
That's
Nice.
true. I think as artists, when the poems start talking to us, that's when they really come alive. If our ego is driving them, they're probably not working, which is very close to church language. You know, it's like the ego's got to die for the poem to really take off. And it's hard to tell when that's going to happen, but you do know it when you get the sense where the thing is telling you what it says. I'm going to be really have tiny short lines without punctuation, and that's what we're going to do. And you're just going to have to listen to it in that moment.
I'm going to talk to you as Humpty Dumpty. And
Yeah, exactly.
That also makes big things special. You know, a lot of my students are always like, feel like afraid of being exposed, or, you know, in their poetry. And I think it's just what you said. I think that fear is also ego, right? When you let the poem go, then you don't feel that exposure or whatnot, because it's not about you anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, it's about you, but it's not about you, right?
right. Takes on a life of its own.
Yeah.
I wanted to shift the conversation a little bit to the natural world, because, you know, Spencer, you talked a lot about how you feel the presence of God or a higher power in the place where you are now in Wyoming. And for Matt, that natural world just seems to be, you know, alive in your poetry. Can you talk about how that influences you and how you bring it into your work? Do you sit outside and write? Do you look out the window? You know, what is it about the natural world that influences your poetry?
I'll go first because it's not fair. I keep nudging Matt's elbow after you ask every question.
I'm moving my elbow further away.
So I'll go first. I quoted E.M. Forrester in the first book of poetry I wrote, and the quote was, "I quite expect to end my life caring most for a place." And I think for me, place, and also not planned, but I've just lived all over the world at this point, and every time I get into a new place, it's like everything shifts. And as I got older, like different languages, different cultures, and that deeply affected everything about me, the way my brain worked, the way I perceived everything, my perceptions, and so it profoundly affected the work every time. And here in Wyoming, you know, I said today in the sermon, you can fit 80 Rhode Islands into one Wyoming, you know, so it's this huge expanse, and, you know, nature is dominant and the people are not. And the challenge for every priest giving a sermon in Jackson Hole is that the sermon is outside the window, so it's hard to compete. And I'm very inspired by nature and by humans too, but definitely by nature and by other cultures, and whether that's, you know, living deep in a city or living by the ocean or in Wyoming, or so. I think place is like my main thing. Yeah. Okay. You can. I won't imagine.
Yeah. I mean, I grew up in the rural West. So I just feel like I've been like it's sort of like my first love is the natural world, I was thinking about Spencer as you were talking. There's a poem in the new book about this experience with my sister as kids in the edge of Salt Lake City out in the summertime, like getting bees when their legs are totally coated in so much pollen that they're these beautiful, elegant, and stingery things that we would just hold just to hold them, and so I think for me, like that zoomed in on like the ordinary beauty of the natural world, living in this place that has these majestic moments and these inspiring moments. But I think I've always been drawn to this like forgettable beauty of the natural world. I feel like that's where it comes from for me, is what's the world that we're in all the time. Like I think about that being in an urban place and knowing the little brown birds, like just the plain little sparrows or whatever they are, that are extraordinarily beautiful in that, there over the like grate that's covering the roots of the tree, and then there's this beautiful bird. So something about that like ordinariness to me feels, I feel like I'm always striving to celebrate that.
Well, I feel like, Spencer, you talked about Deanne Arbus as being the photographer, as being an influence. And and when you guys are talking, I feel like that's the difference between when you're a photographer and you bring that lens in really close versus getting the vastness of the Ansel Adams type landscape of the West versus, sometimes Elliot Porter or somebody else is just going to hone in on something very, very small and very important. And I feel like you're doing both in that poetry, in your work and in the poetry, I think. And Richard, you've got some grand landscapes in your work as well. I don't know your new book coming out, but I was thinking about that book you did with Jake Hessler too, and
the landscape photographer.
Yeah.
I feel I again with agreeing with both Matt and Spencer, I see the divine in nature. My first, you grew up in the Midwest. I grew up in Miami Beach, so like for me, it's like always the ocean. I can't live very far away from the ocean, and like there's always ocean imagery, no matter what. It always comes back in. My sense of it, though, and part of its power for me has been in my own sort of revolving question about home, that nature is the ultimate universal home. And I think that's partly kind of like God, because it comes on its own terms, right? Like you can't redecorate the forest. Like I've tried. Right? Like and there's a peace in knowing that you just be in it, right? And I think for me, that is a sense also of finding an ultimate home. And for us Mainers here, I think that's what I found in Maine as well. I mean, growing up at the beach was fine, but you're surrounded by this huge city. But the presence of nature in Maine, which is what Spencer Mary does, and you two met, continues to be a real draw for me. So now I have both. Living in Miami Beach part-time, my Maine part-time. So, and I think that's what's been calling me, and besides the people and community and all the rest. But I think it's to have those two landscapes in my life right now is very special.
I may invite anybody to put some questions in the chat if you'd like to ask questions of our poets here today. You brought up marriage, and Spencer talked about marriage, and Matt, I think you mentioned the ashes of a marriage in one of your poems. So let's talk a little bit about that, if you will, and how that, how that plays out in your life and in your poetry and in your work and in the way you see the world. Richard, has it changed for you? You're the newlywed here.
Yeah, no, but we've been together 23 years. So like it was like I woke up one day and I was married. No, I never understood marriage. I mean, I did understand it, but never understood the ceremony of marriage, still going through that process, which is so unexpectedly beautiful. And part of it was planned in 3 weeks, and part of it was what the real surprise was that maybe like a poem. It wasn't like, oh, I love Mark and all this and happily ever after 23 years, but it was more like seeing your love reflected in others. And I was like, well, if they think we love each other, surely we must. There's such joy in that ceremony, right? And that was really surprising and really brought me to tears. Was like, yeah, like we're talking about a poem, right? Like how important it is to see it in other people, and like that made it real in another way. And Mark, over the years, how he's played it, he's my first reader. He always tells me I don't know how to fix it, but and he grades my poems and like puts little hearts and stuff. So he's nothing leaves the house unless I get at least a B+. So
That's great. Well, Spencer, you talked about some long-term marriages that influenced your life.
Yeah. For me, in my autobiography or my life, the story of my life, I was very involved in my parents' marriage. I was born 10 months right after they got married, and we went through the Vietnam War together, and race riots and the assassinations, and they had ups and downs in their lives, and we had ups and downs with each other. But I realize now that it was a big marriage. It was, and they were big, they loomed large in my life, and their commitment to one another was profound. So and then when I just married this young couple, like I say, in Rhode Island, it just sort of, came out of left field. Well, not totally. So, I try pretty hard not to cry during any services, because it's important to get a message across on my part. Even though I'm an emotional person, I definitely feel things and I emote. And we started this wedding in Rhode Island, and everything was fine, and we had rehearsed it. And so the groom was on my left and the bride on my right. And just as I started with Dearly Beloved, I could see that the groom was going to lose it. I was like, oh no. And so I thought, well, maybe just a little bit, but he did lose it. And then the whole congregation kind of lost it, and we had to pass around the Kleenex, and it was very lovely. And I realized how sacred it was, and that we were all witnessing it, and we were all supporting it. And I don't know, there's, Matt.
Well, yeah, no, it's funny that you asked this question, because I just officiated a wedding yesterday morning. That was, I guess maybe this says a little bit of how I feel about this is my ex-stepfather's daughter from his marriage after he and my mother divorced. So
Would you follow that?
She's 20 years younger than me, and how much our family came together in the space after marriages, and so there's something about marriage and what's after for me. And it's very much true in the way that my former wife and I share raising a son, that's both, that our marriage speaks to that, and then we're also beyond that, so I guess I'm really interested in sort of what comes after marriage, because in my life it's been quite beautiful in lots of ways, that some relationships broke open in a way because the marriage ended. If that makes sense. We're shifted in ways that are beautiful. So
yeah, I think you said, Spencer, something also about the marriage as another kind of marriage earlier.
Yes. Occurs to me, I'm, as I said, 60, and I've been single for pretty much most of my life. even though I knew this big marriage of my parents. And what's happened in my life has been these kind of like platonic guy. I mean, I don't know if calling them marriage is too intense, but they've been these long-term work
Oh,
relationships that, you know, the first book of poetry I wrote was working with this guy at Brooks Brothers who, you know, was, you know, we have these other kind of bonds with people
yeah.
that are very intimate.
Yeah, I remember that's when you're talking about the bishop, and I was like, I've met the bishop.
Yeah.
That's a hell of a marriage. No, it just made me rethink about what we think about marriage, right? Like, so our commitment to poetry is marriage, and it goes through bad times and it goes through good times. Our commitment to so many endeavors, I think your commitment in another way, Spencer, right, to the clergy, to the church is an incredible, beautiful kind of marriage as well. And Matt, I don't know you that well, but it seems obviously that there's marriages that happen for you after the marriage, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
I think when we make a commitment to some person or something, it never completely leaves us.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
You know, we may change and we may move on and we may, you know, separate or whatever, but we may lose a partner, but it's always become that a part of us. And I think of that. Yeah, I hope that's true poetry for so many people that, you know, for me, hearing a poem, it becomes a part of me. Certain poems are just, you know, just stay there, and some come and they go. And I think the process of writing them, and maybe we could talk a little bit about process too, because I think you know, is that a long, arduous process? Does it come easily? You know, is it something, Matt, you've written that those really long poems in your new book? Do you write them over a period of months or weeks, or how is your practice?
Yeah, it's very much dependent on the project. Again, I sort of like ending up in a project, and then I think, like Spencer was saying, the project starts to say what it needs to be, you know. So that was in this collection. I love this, that there were lots of different characters, people, and it was confusing readers who was there, you know. And so the poem started as a response to the writings of an ancestor of mine who was a problematic figure, and so I just decided, well, what if I just turned everyone into my ancestor? I just went through the whole book and changed every reference to every human being into my ancestor. And so suddenly it created, I mean, that was it created this dynamic where if ancestor means who comes before, then, you know, a friend who leads you into your first experience in a natural world is in a way sort of the ancestor, you know. So anyway, it just there was a happy accident, I guess. I feel like my process is sometimes the happy accident, and then just stretching it, seeing where that's going to go, for me. So it's, yeah.
And at what point do you know it's a project, Matt?
Yeah, I think that the book that's coming out really started as a project that I didn't know what was going to happen. It was just kind of responding to these other writings and thinking, I'll try this for a while, and then that started to gain its own traction. I think when the poems didn't go where I thought they were going to, that's when I knew it was a project, you know, in a way, because I thought it was going to be this response that was about gender and race and power, and then it all became these like love songs of the natural world is how it felt. And that's when I knew that the project was going somewhere that I had not intended, and that I was going to get to follow it along, you know. So
I
Yeah.
love that's that process of discovery. That's,
Mm.
the
Mhm.
exciting part of writing poetry, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
Spencer, did you want to talk about your process a little bit? I understand from some of your interviews that you take a long time with writing.
Yeah, it wasn't really planned that way, but the first book was gestated over like 25 years. And so I had this, because of the way I came into the world, into publishing world, there was such this long period of rewriting, then that's sort of what I knew. And then since then it's been like that. Like it's just as slow. Not a bad thing. I just met with my publisher in New York, and we're talking about like a collected, because there just isn't that hasn't been that much, which is completely fine with the poetry with me. And if there isn't that much, that's okay. The memoir that I wrote took me 17 years to write, from the time I started it until I finished it. That was a whole different experience of writing and teaching myself, because I didn't know how to write it. So I had to read all these books about how do you write that kind of a thing. And that again was this process of about 12 years into it. It suddenly told me what it was going to be and how I was going to do it. And then it took another 5 years to get there. With the painting that you referenced, that's another thing I do. I do those very quickly, but I enjoy doing them. The stakes are low, but they give me a tremendous amount of pleasure. And then with the sermons that as part of my job, this is like another kind of writing, another part of my brain. It's like a New York Times crossword puzzle. I've got it. It's a time constraint. It's a word constraint. They've all got to stop at 1,000 words for me. And so that I do like every single week. And so that has to come in a couple of hours.
Mm.
It's going to be oral. And what was the other word for ear? I never remembered that. Like oral and then aural.
Auditory.
No, it's aural or yeah, auditory. But there's was oral, and anyway,
Right.
it's for the ear and for the mouth. So there's been different gears, but the poetry is slow. But now I'm just sort of used to that.
Yeah.
And I almost don't trust it. I mean, some things come really fast, like something will come really, really fast and be like a tyranny in my brain, and I won't be able to get rid of it. A mother's, what is that? The mother's universe is love in reverse. So I think maybe that came quickly to me, and it was part of a bigger poem. And then I thought, oh no, I think that's it. And it just sort of obsessed me. And I wasn't even sure if it made sense. And then I thought, no, it makes sense. And as my mother declined, especially, and but it hung out for a long time, and then the title came, and so it's kind of how it goes.
Richard, did you want to comment about process?
I'll do, I just want to say I've witnessed I've witnessed Spencer at work, and it takes a long time, not because he's goofing around. I mean, he takes his poems everywhere. On the train in Spain, he was like revising, and I'm almost envious that he can take that long. I mean, I consider me a long writer. Like my gestation period is like 5 years. I don't know how people. I mean, I guess also because when I published my first book, I was empty, and every time I finish a book, it's starting from scratch. But I also try to remember that, one of the poets that Spencer and I have in common with, Elizabeth Bishop. How many books does she publish? I mean, 5? I mean, people have 5 books these days, by the time they're mid-career poets. So I try to, I've learned from Spencer in a sense, to sort of take your time a bit more, and also in terms of, as they say, quality versus quantity. But it's a different world, I know, than Elizabeth Bishop's time, but still.
Interesting that you mentioned that, and somebody's asking in the chat what poets have influenced each of you. And so you both mentioned Elizabeth Bishop. I think you had 7 poets in your memoir, Spencer.
I did, and those remain some of the strongest influences in my life. And Richard's at the end of that book, and a poem by Richard and a poem by Greg Pardlow. The book ends with another kind of influence, which is the contemporary people that are in my life. And just as the church has made a family, now as my own is leaving the planet, poetry has given me brothers like Matt and like Richard, and it's a lovely thing.
Yeah.
But that's kind of an influence in its own way. But definitely Sylvia Plath in that memoir. Sylvia Plath was a huge influence on me in my early life, and George Herbert and Gerard Manley Hopkins and James Merrill, whom I met in my early life, who died of AIDS in 1990. Huge influence poetically and personally. And there's another one. Emily Dickinson was huge too. So,
How about you, Matt?
Yeah, I think I guess the people I think of, and I just missed studying with William Stafford, but William Stafford and then Naomi Shihab Nye to me are people that I always return to. Kind of what good can this do in the world? You know, I feel like I try to ask myself that when revising or when working, like what can this poem do more than be a poem? If that, I don't know quite if that makes sense, but just because I think the generosity of those of Stafford's, and then of course Naomi's, right? And then I guess otherwise there's the sprawl of someone like I love Allen Ginsberg for the sprawl of it. I sort of feel like sometimes I get too controlled in thinking about my poems, and then I'll settle into. I love the Sunflower Sutra as a poem that I return to all the time, because it's just kind of a messy poem, and there's something about that I love too. Like, how do I put the mess back in here? You know, feels really kind of exciting to me. So, but Stafford is the person I just read all the time.
Mm.
yeah, he's cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder how you select a poet to read in depth. I mean, if you're in an MFA program, somebody suggests, hey, you should read this and that and the other thing. But if you're just exploring on your own, is it happenstance, or do you, how do you think about who do I want to look at and study and learn more about?
I think it's like seeing Diane Arbus's photograph somewhere, and you're like, what the heck? And it's just like speaks to you. Hold on, keep talking.
Okay.
Hey.
Yeah, I
As soon as it's over, I come get you.
sorry, I'm listening to the logistics happening. There's something about, I just think like the way, sorry, I'm gonna stop talking because I can't.
I'm gonna, ask Richard to talk for a
Yeah.
moment.
Oh, sure. No, I was resonating with what you said, Matt, in a way, because I also, well, it's kind of your question too, right? Who do you read in depth, right? But there are individual poems that I come back to all the time, including the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, right? And One Art, which I could read 1,000 times, but and they always teach me something new. And so also I kind of try to pair it up when I sit down and write. Okay, I'm a nature poem. Let's say I feel like dressing up like Mary Oliver. So I'll read a couple Mary Oliver poems just to like sort of get my head in that world. And Naomi, like one of my favorite from Naomi is kindness. I could every time I have a poem that sort of wants to touch on something that can't really put my fingers around. Like I'm just like, okay. And then I watch videos of her reading it too. Like, so like, to like get even the spoken piece of it. But yeah, I think, when you run across 2 or 3 poems by someone, it's time to get into depth with them. Even more contemporary for me, our current poet laureate, Ada Limon, is amazing to me. Always has been, right? Not a new read for me. Like, so, yeah, and the other thing is, sure, like I always tell my students, like not every poems are going to be like amazing, right? Like I tell my students, when you read a book of poetry, if you find 4 amazing poems in there, the book has done its job, right? Like you don't, the rest you might not, but it's done its job, and so
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
What were you going to say?
I was just going to say, I love also the number of ways that poems can just show up in your life now, and especially through like the power of all the like one-a-days in the inbox, I feel like that's in one of the ways I discover who to really read in detail is if I see a poem that I love, I'll try to track down that, the work of that poet, whether it's an old poem or something that, was published this year. And yeah, Richard, I love what you're saying too. Like also then to trust that, if I start reading, I love the poem that shows up in the inbox, start reading a book and get 12 poems in and I'm not really loving any of them, that to keep giving it time, and to know that in across the course of a collection that there might be a few that really speak directly to me as a reader, is a few is a pretty solid number.
There's a question in the chat from Vicky, and it's addressed to Matt, but I'm not sure. It says you'd mentioned the grief you were feeling around your father and your block with writing now. Can you talk about that? Was that Matt or Spencer that talked
I guess
about
it's because Matt and I look so much alike.
Yeah.
Grief you had.
Feeling about your father and a block from writing as a result.
Well, grief is just a funny thing, and kind of comes in waves, and it kind of, I don't know, just leaves me empty. And I guess it's coincided with the completion of the book, and so I'm just left inarticulate, I guess, before that that loss. And my mother is also diminishing greatly, and so that's there too. And yeah, I don't know what else to say.
Yeah, I think we need time to process those things, and sometimes we process it in the writing, and sometimes it takes a while. But I think that today we've talked about joy and grief and, the spiritual world and so many topics. Are there any last words or last things you'd like to leave our audience with? Last thoughts here for today.
I love poetry so much. I don't exactly understand why. I remember when my father was dying. My father was a Southerner. He was a sportsman. He was a doctor, and we were driving him around to doctor's appointments. And he said, he was quiet for most of his life. And he was like, we were driving and it was quiet. And that's the only time he would talk to me because my mother talked. And so he said, quiet. And he said, poetry. Why poetry? And I said, he was like, why not basketball? Why poetry? And I said, I don't know. And he's like, okay, all right. So I don't know. It's a mystery. It's a great joy, and it expands my world. And so it's and with friends and people and orphans in Honduras, and it just keeps getting bigger in Wyoming, and it's brought so much to me that I can never do enough to give back to it.
Isn't that wonderful to think about how it expands our world?
Yeah.
Yes, that. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Spencer.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's it. Like when we put into words what we've always felt but never heard before, like that just happened right then. So I love that. Thank you.
Mhm.
Yeah. I just think for me, it's this community that's created that has expanded my world. And certainly today, hearing both of you read your poetry and having a chance to talk with you and having Richard come on too, it's just, that's expanded my world today in a wonderful way. And hopefully for so many other people who joined us.
Well, like, and just to, one last, knowing Richard expanded my life and my world. And he was one of the people, I was in my 40s and I was scared about learning Spanish because I thought it was too old. Everything that was going to come out of my mouth was stupid. That's what was my fear. And he encouraged me. And my world got bigger because of him.
Mm,
Mine too, in other ways, in very important ways, but very important ways. Well, I went down to the orphanage and spent time with Spencer there, and that was what, like, still to this day I'm in connection with them. So
wow.
He has a great poem about the Rio Grande in the voice of the river. It's beautiful.
it's dedicated to one of the girls in the who ended up
That is a
sponsoring.
beautiful poem.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, that's great. Thank you all for being here today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Meg.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Take care.
See ya.
Bye.
Bye now.
Yeah.